Thank you to the Global Shelter Cluster for giving us the opportunity to have this session. Our aim today is to explore how fire safety can be better considered and implemented in shelter and settlements and in humanitarian settings more widely. My name is Danielle Antonellis, and I'm a fire safety engineer. I spent the past 6 years working with Eric, and I'm now founder and executive director of Kindling, dedicated to supporting fire safety improvements in humanitarian contexts, emerging nations, and low-income communities. I'm here today with Jim Kennedy, who's an independent consultant and is on the board of directors for Kindling. And we are co-hosting this session with Liz Palmer, the global construction lead at Save the Children. We're also very lucky to have Phil Deloy with us today, who's a humanitarian advisor to the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, formerly DFID. I am sharing my screen, so hopefully everyone can see it. So we have quite a lot of ground to cover in this 30-minute session today. First, I'm going to talk about fire risk and fire safety in humanitarian contexts. Then Liz is going to share a case study on interagency coordination and fire risk reduction in Lebanon. And then Jim will share some quick insights from fire research into the performance of plastic tarpaulins. And finally, we'll discuss opportunities to develop fire safety best practices through interagency and intercluster coordination. So global estimates of annual lives lost from fire are up to 300,000. That means that fire kills up to 5 times more people than natural hazard-related disasters. And according to a 2014 World Health Organization report, 2.5 times as many people die from fire each year than to war-related injury. Camps and informal settlements are particularly vulnerable to fire. The primary causes relate to cooking, heating, and lighting, and poor electrical conditions, and fires are frequent and they spread with devastating speed due to physical factors such as high density of homes and the use of combustible construction materials such as plastic tarpaulins, bamboo, timber, and even cardboard. Combined with limited capacity of those affected to respond and recover, we know people living in camps and informal settlements are disproportionately affected. But unfortunately, there are no global statistics for fire in humanitarian settings, and the reliability of locally collected data is often questionable. But we can look to past fires for insights. There are 9 camps in northern Thailand for refugees that fled conflict in Burma or Myanmar since 1984. These camps are built from wood and bamboo, and thatched roofs are common. There have been several large fires, such as this fire in 2012 in the Umpiam Mai camp, which destroyed at least 1,000 homes, 3 mosques, and 2 nursery schools. Tragically, in 2013, 37 people lost their lives in a fire in the Ban Mai Sarin camp. 100 additional people were injured, and more than 2,300 people were left homeless. According to the Border Consortium, fire continues to be the greatest threat to life and safety in these camps. There we go. More recently, there were the fires in the Moria Reception and Identification Center on Lesbos Island in Greece, which captured global attention. Between September 8th and 10th, fires broke out in 3 different spots in Moria, resulting with the displacement of more than 12,000 refugees. In the weeks after the fire, people were sleeping in the streets before being relocated to a new camp on the island. Reports indicate the fires in Moria were caused by arson. Some may therefore say that this disaster was not preventable because the ignition was intentional. But I want to be very clear that the disaster was preventable. The physical conditions in the camp and its layout are what enabled the fire to spread so rapidly across the entire camp. This fire shows the importance of considering fire mitigation in shelter and settlements. Whether the ignition source is intentional or accidental, a fire can lead to a catastrophe if fire risk is not mitigated appropriately. Improving fire safety is a matter of accountability to affected populations who don't have the means to protect themselves. There is limited advocacy on this issue and even more limited guidance and tools on fire risk reduction. This slide highlights just some of the fires that have occurred at camps and informal settlements around the world. While not all informal settlements are humanitarian settings, there is much to learn about fire safety from development contexts. Also, fire safety improvements contribute to resilience building of an affected population, which is critical, especially in protracted crises. Fire safety should therefore be considered through the humanitarian development nexus. I'm going to pass over to Jim for him to talk about fire through the Global Shelter Cluster strategy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much, Danielle. I hope not only that everybody can see the slide, but that everybody recognizes the slide, and maybe that some people can actually quote the slide. This is actually the Global Shelter Cluster Strategy current until the next couple of years. I thought I'd put this up just to show to what degree issues of fire safety can and should be integrated into this strategy. Next slide, please, Danielle. There we go. Thank you. So that was my multimedia animation for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you notice, there's a subtle difference between the previous slide and this one. This one has got some red rings around certain areas. And I think it doesn't really need a lot of explication if we look from the right hand of the screen to the left to see that obviously issues of fire safety do touch on skills, increased capacity to respond. It's obvious that there is still a massive lack of evidence, and that the gaps do need to be filled in terms of shelter materials, in terms of site planning, and in terms of working with other sectors, in terms of behavioural change as well, which looks then at influencing at what is the appropriate type of assistance, including knowledge transfer assistance. And then if we move over to coordination, how can we do that not only in area-based approaches, settlements approaches, but also how can we do that in an integrated way with other clusters, with WASH, with camp management, and the funny little head on the far left of the slide is actually how do we then get that to connect with recovery and connect that to the nexus. Next slide. I'm handing back.
Thank you, Jim. So why are camps and informal settlements so susceptible to fire? The fire triangle provides a very simple answer. All three components, fuel, heat, and oxygen, are needed to have fire. In camps or informal settlements, there's plenty of oxygen, and there are many diverse heat sources or ignition sources, such as cigarettes or open fires for cooking, heating, and lighting. There's also significant fuel, shelters, NFIs, personal belongings, etc. When considering fire safety, it is important we are clear on what we are trying to achieve. What are the goals? Is the primary goal life safety, or is it protection of property more important, or perhaps protection of livelihoods or the environment? In building codes and standards, life safety is almost always the primary goal. And a positive co-benefit is that fire safety interventions driven by life safety often support protection of property. Building owners or insurers sometimes require protection of property or business continuity to also be prioritized in design and implementation of a project. And protection of livelihoods are rarely included in fire strategy development, but ought to be considered much more often. In many parts of the world, there is an assumption that insurance or governments will provide safety nets for fire victims, but this is typically not the case in development and humanitarian contexts. Finally, considerable resources and efforts are invested into sustainability and protection of the environment. For building design, that might mean choosing construction products with less embodied carbon or which enable energy efficiency. Material choices often include highly insulating plastic-based materials, which are highly combustible. Not only can this undermine life safety, but little attention is paid to the fact that the least sustainable outcome of a project would be it burning down. In a fire, toxic chemicals are released into the air, water, and earth. Damaged materials and contents are wasted, and buildings might need to be rebuilt entirely. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet for fire safety. A holistic approach is needed, which addresses key fire safety principles, such as fire detection and communication, occupant protection, fire containment, and fire extinguishment. Since most humanitarian guidelines and standards focus almost only on fire spread, I want to spend a bit of time on this today. Limiting fire spread between shelters and throughout settlements is a really important principle to support the fire safety goals we outlined earlier. The Sphere Handbook and other humanitarian guidelines often recommend to keep 2 meters between buildings, or if possible, double the building height to prevent collapsing structures from touching adjacent buildings. While this is an important rule of thumb, I haven't found any references to fire testing or engineering justification to this rule. And of course, we know that in many different settlements around the world, this isn't even achieved with the 2 meters because of space considerations or constraints. But we can look to some research carried out by IRIS Fire, a program by the University of Edinburgh and Stellenbosch University, which studies fire spread in South African informal settlements. They carried out numerous experiments to study fire dynamics within dwelling compartments and fire spread between dwellings. The image here shown is from a mock 20-dwelling test settlement aimed at understanding settlement scale fire spread behavior. It is important to note that construction materials, contents, ventilation conditions, and settlement layouts vary massively due to the inherent nature of informal settlements and camps. And efforts were made to standardize the experiment results reproducible. But as you can see from the image, the testing arrangement was based on South African informal settlements and isn't necessarily directly reflective of humanitarian settings. But we still can learn valuable insights from this work, especially in terms of fire spread mechanisms. The illustration here demonstrates the 3 primary fire spread mechanisms to consider: flame impingement, branding or spotting or embers, and radiation. At the shelter scale, key factors that influence fire spread include materials and methods of construction, gaps in construction, location and size of doors and windows, and spatial relationships to other shelters or combustible items, such as waste or vegetation. External factors such as humidity, wind, and topography also impact fire spread, as well as wider settlement planning considerations. I want to refer you to the numerous papers by IRIS Fire for more information on the experiments. Also, Stellenbosch University will soon be publishing a free ebook called Fire Safety Engineering Guideline for Informal Settlements, towards practical solutions for a complex problem. I am proud to be a co-author for this first edition, which will undoubtedly continue to evolve as we learn more from research, practice, and future fire incidents. While many aspects discussed here are highly contextual to South Africa, some of the principles can contribute to a wider discussion around fire safety and development in humanitarian contexts. And like other disaster risk, it can be useful to consider fire safety through the lens of the disaster cycle with its 4 stages: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. This is a framework we developed at ARUP for fire safety in informal settlements, and we definitely don't have time to go through it, so I provided a QR code on the bottom right, which you can use to access the full document. I do want to highlight a couple of quick points. First, fire is highly socio-technical. People's decisions and behaviors have a direct impact on fire risk and fire consequences. It is therefore important that we acknowledge the diverse and complex socio-cultural relationships people have with fire. These relationships shape people's values, beliefs, and attitudes towards fire, and will influence their perception of fire risk and their behavior. For example, we often hear that fire is an act of God, indicating that people think nothing can be done about it. But there are things we can do to improve fire safety, and we need to work within people's systems of beliefs and values. Secondly, it is critical we acknowledge that not all fire is bad. We use fire every day in one form or another, and in humanitarian settings, people rely on fire for cooking, heating, and lighting, among other things. While efforts to prevent or reduce ignition sources are critical, eliminating fire is not possible. Instead, we need to focus on controlling fire, or really risk reduction. There's an old proverb: fire is a great servant, but a bad master. The framework can help to facilitate dialogue around fire safety, but it is only conceptual in nature. Practical tools and resources are needed to support fire risk reduction. Along those lines, the Sphere Handbook also notes fire risk assessments should inform site planning. But how do you carry out a fire risk assessment for a camp or informal settlement? Unfortunately, there are no guidance or tools to support humanitarian actors in carrying out these assessments, and fire safety considerations are not well integrated into other assessment tools used by shelter and settlement specialists. Humanitarian organizations sometimes arrange for international firefighters to fly out to a camp, carry out a fire risk assessment, and provide recommendations on ways to improve fire safety. This only happens when fire is identified as a significant issue locally, usually after a very large fire, and where resources and timelines allow. While this approach can be very beneficial, the outcomes are highly reliant on the expert judgment of the fire specialists. Their level of understanding of the local context and what is not appropriate and achievable in humanitarian settings is critical. And there are very few people with the relevant knowledge and expertise globally. In a few minutes, Liz will talk about a really great example of this from Lebanon. But in general, what is the current state of fire safety knowledge and practice in the humanitarian sector? The truth is we don't really know. Coordinated efforts have not been made to collect lessons from past fires and learning from context-specific fire safety programming. There's a need to gather evidence and insights to describe the current state of fire safety in the humanitarian sector so we can learn from what has been done in the past and identify gaps and opportunities to improve fire safety in the future. As a cross-cutting issue, fire safety needs coordination between agencies, clusters, and often with the There are specific aspects of fire safety which are relevant for each cluster. Some of them are shown here. While protective actions can be taken independently by each cluster, a well-coordinated system of fire safety should be the goal. Perhaps we need tools to support interagency and intercluster coordination for fire safety. I'm going to pass over to Liz to talk about a fire risk assessment and response case study in Lebanon.
Great, thanks so much, Danielle. And just, I'm not sure if that video is working, but just to say we're very lucky to have joining us today Steve Jordan from the Operation Florian, who was the partner instrumental in putting in place all the successes that we had in Lebanon with this response. So yeah, next slide, please. In 2015, 2016, with the refugee crisis in Lebanon, there had been some catastrophic fires historically in the country, and the interagency partners were attempting to do something about it, but it was very ad hoc, it was very uncoordinated and unsatisfactory. And it just seems to escalate. By 2017, they had started recording a high number of fires in this context, particularly in the informal tented settlements, which had very, very high density. They were recorded very high loss of life around children that we as an agency determined too high a risk for us to deem acceptable, and in 2016 Save the Children initiated a fire risk reduction assessment of refugee and vulnerable host communities in Lebanon, and this is where the Operation Florian team come in. We were most fortunate to partner with this organisation, UK-based firefighters who have connections and contacts in not only response as firefighters themselves, but also the theoretical, the research, and some of the most up-to-date response mechanisms are available to us. And as a result of that fire risk reduction assessment, which I should mention was actually conducted at a nationwide level, it was quite extraordinary feat. There was a number of recommendations made in the final report, which is an excellent document that led to a massive amount of interventions through the years of 2017, 2018, and continuing on to this day. And some of the key activities there, of course, are training, setting up temporary technical committees, and also making sure that training and fire safety tools, etc., were harmonized. Next slide, please. One of the first and most critical elements of the response was the assessment identified the absolute lack of coordination between the different sectors, the NGOs and INGOs, the UN bodies, host and refugee communities, and also right up to the national and local, the civil defence. There was just no communication at all. One of the biggest issues was that the NGOs were all talking to each other about how they should be doing response, but not actually coordinated and agreed on a single strategy. There was no communication at all with the host and refugee community about what they should be doing to enhance their safety. And at a national level, the work that was being done by the humanitarian community was not at all being communicated back to the core response actors, the Lebanese civil defence. And one of the main issues here, of course, was that we had developed a P code system for all the camps. There was an entire map that could easily be clicked on to identify the locations, and yet the Lebanese civil defence had no line of communication to that mapping, and there was no setup of how to communicate. If you were a refugee how do you communicate with your local civil defence, and how do they know where to find you in the rabbit warren that is the Lebanese road network. So this was the first core act that was put in place that broke down a lot of barriers, and it also created a layer of responsibility and accountability at each set or layer in the community and the stakeholders. Next slide, please. The second set was looking at prevention and preparedness, and an extensive strategy was developed in order to address this. And as Danielle said, there isn't really a strategy for such a response within the humanitarian community, but looking at almost all layers of risk, they tried to put in place SOPs, standards, firefighting kits and techniques, so a lot of training in that, looking at how to respond if there was a fire. So in this case, disassemble the structures as fast as possible that might be likely to create a fire break, to prevent fire spread. There was also firefighting and detection kit, and particularly important was the community engagement, where we focused a gender-focused approach. Next slide, please. The next level was obviously prevention and preparedness, and this really comes back to the stakeholders, but particularly working with the communities and the responders in terms of awareness of fire risk, because as Danielle mentioned, the social interpretation of fire risk is, sometimes just it's an act of God, but in other cases what we tried to do was put in their hands the responsibility of managing the fire risk around them. Hazard mapping of communities was an extensive activity so that they were engaged in understanding evacuation procedures and also how to reduce risk with, as Danielle mentioned, if there was debris or planting, space, distance between shelters, etc. And then one of the biggest focus groups was the training. So within the communities at a community level, looking at evacuation and fire wardens. Within the response, how should you be using a fire extinguisher? Because this actually did involve distributing fire extinguishers to every settlement. Particularly focused on the home and women, training on how to look to have safe cooking and reducing the fire risk in their home. A response for everyone: what do you do if you catch fire? How do you deal with a burn? And then also teaching children specifically how to minimize the risk of fire, because it was seen that many times it was a candle that had been knocked over by a child, etc. And then also, very, very important was obviously keeping those messages going. So maintaining the fire safety awareness sessions within the community so that everyone was constantly reminded and made aware of the risk that was continuing around them. Next slide, please. Within the multi-stakeholder approach, they also had to address both urban and camp response. In Lebanon, we have a very extensive refugee population that is integrated into the community at all levels, within the informal settlements and also in residential and non-residential buildings. So a number of activities were put in place to address community level, household level, and also within Save the Children, the child-friendly approach. So there was a real community level ownership around this, where firefighting teams were created, roles were appointed for focal points, drills, making sure that there were safe zones maintained, and of course training around fire safety, firefighting, use of fire extinguishers, etc. And making sure that within that community level that everybody was agreeing to those clear routes for escape, that nobody was filling it up with another shelter or another, structure to undo all the good work that had been created. They also had, within a household level, ownership by the families, how to manage for their home risk, and also accounting for the most vulnerable community members. And then what has been incredibly successful, of course, is the child-friendly approach through the families and also through the schools, is increased awareness around fire safety for children. Next slide, please. Finally, the final point of approach was post-monitoring, evaluation and incident reporting. Prior to this activity, we had very, very bad data on fires. And as a result of this project, there's now a very comprehensive lessons learnt database where we're really beginning to understand how we can improve on shelter design. That picture on the bottom right is actually a fire break and a testing of a fire break for the shelters using the very simple materials that are allowed in the camps, plastic sheeting and timber. But there was some special dispensations made by the government to allow us to put in place fire breaks between shelters, and a lot of improved materials for reducing fire risk. And as a result of this, we've seen a tremendous improvement at all levels of the fire response and fire risk mitigation in Lebanon. We've certainly learnt from this and applied a lot of lessons to other countries. There's obviously a lot more that can be done. And I must say that the success of this project was 100% driven by the determination of the Save the Children Lebanon team. Unfortunately, you couldn't be here today, in making sure that this project was successful, and also the incredible efforts of the Operation Florian team. And I'd just like to give Steve an opportunity to feedback if you have any comments on the project and your experiences in Lebanon. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks, Liz. Just to let you know, I'm really pleased to see that Laura Hurst is also on the call as well, and Laura is one of the principal team members as well. So no, I mean, I've got really nothing else to add other than to say that really the success of the project was very much driven by the desire to want to make the improvements by the Save the Children team, but also to ensure that there was that interagency cooperation, which I think was really essential. I think the critical thing as well is also the fact that they've kept the monitoring process ongoing. And in terms of sort of like changes of habitation, I think that's been quite important, because as time has gone on, we've seen the dynamics of the camps change, both in terms of encroachment, so that the camps have expanded, not just in terms of a horizontal, but also in terms of vertical. And I think that is a really important feature for everybody to bear in mind in terms of the increased fire loading and fire risk, and actually being able to adapt and change education and monitoring in that sense. I think the other point as well that we talked about earlier on was about, certainly from my perspective as an organisation, is learning about recovery, really featuring recovery as an essential element within any sort of like planning for any settlements, refugee camps or informal settlements, because there is always the inevitable, what might happen if, and actually how can you, if a camp grows in an unplanned way and an event does happen, a tragic event, how do you rebuild it back with all the fire safety elements, rather than kind of like pre-planning that or trying to work something out in a very short space of time. But no, I mean, the success of the project was really down to Save the Children. I have to say to Liz and Ryan, thank you ever so much.
Oh, thank you, Steve. It's been an incredibly beneficial partnership, and I think we were all full of great ideas about what this has taught us and where we can take this into the future. So I think I'm now going to hand over to Phil. There you go. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks so much, Liz. Yes, I think there's growing recognition of just how important it is to manage fire risks in all their forms, in all sorts of different ways within the humanitarian context. And there's a growing body of research and examples of best practice out there, like the one that Liz has just talked us through. But this sort of body of expertise and the evidence that we've got is really sort of existing in parallel at the moment, through disparate, relatively unrelated groups. And so it's been a real pleasure working with Danielle and with Jim Kennedy and Liz, who's just spoken, and Steve Jordan at Operation Florian and FireAid, among others. But there really does remain a significant number of gaps, and there remains scope for potential duplication of efforts. So FCDO, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, formerly DFID, is really keen to see a more formal approach to fire risk management in our sector more globally. I'm going to pass to Jim in a second, who's going to share another bit of good practice. FCDO commissioned Jim, following a prompt from FireAid, to put together a really extensive report on fire retardants in plastic. FCDO is moving on those findings now, and other findings that come later. Jim, if I could turn to you. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Phil. And next slide. So the last slide was actually a piece of plastic sheeting that was being used, actually plastic sheeting from the UK government in Mozambique, and with a dormant fire right next to it. And the research that I undertook for what was DFID, FCDO, was on fire performance of plastic sheeting, tarps, and what degree and whether it was recommendable to actually adopt a standard for fire resistance for tarpaulins, for plastic sheeting, heavy duty plastic sheeting. I want to share with you exactly 2 slides. I know we're getting fairly close to the half hour, with some key takeaways from that report. Firstly, solving the problem of fire retardancy in plastic sheeting is not going to solve the problem of fire safety in camps, particularly as in most camps that we've seen in the world, plastic sheeting, whether in shelters or in educational structures or anything else, takes up a minority of the different materials which are being used to build things, which may be themselves even more flammable, cardboard or straw or things like that. And furthermore, there is a risk that if somebody comes along and says, we have a magic plastic sheet which will never burn, it gives a false sense of security for people to then say, well, we don't need to do any sort of fire safety training, behavioral training, anything like that. And then also, there's still far too little evidence about the various types of chemicals that could be used for plastic sheeting to improve fire retardancy, and what that would have in other terms in impact for the environment, for the durability of the sheeting, or other parts of the logistics. How much does it weigh? How much does extra will it cost? Next slide. Part of the challenge is the fact that plastic sheeting is a massive industry and industrial secrets are jealously guarded. And so that it is at the moment almost impossible to test a plastic sheet to figure out what's actually inside it in terms of any fire resistant chemicals or indeed chemicals. Professionals in the testing industry can have a guess, but it's not something that you could actually ever test for. Therefore, testing at the moment for plastic sheeting is just a performance test. Does it burn or not? Or how rapidly does it burn or not? There is no test for what is in it which might prevent or slow down the burning or not. And not all fire tests are the same. You might think that it's quite simple. You get a flame and you put it to a piece of plastic sheeting. Plastic sheeting, like many other construction materials, performs differently, whether it's a small flame on a small piece of plastic sheeting or a larger flame on an entire shelter or an entire structure. And the problem is that, as we know in the field, you could get into a lot of trouble if you randomly start burning down whole shelters or entire plastic sheets as a testing regime, right in the middle of people who have nothing. So the most relevant tests are also the ones which are least likely to be undertaken, not to mention the actual research alluding to the photos that Danielle showed from South Africa, which might give us even more information about what actually happens, not just to a single shelter, but to an entire settlement. These are some of the key gaps which...
Oops, just move to the next slide. There we go. So in summary, our goal is to develop best practices to help reduce deaths, injuries, and losses from fire in humanitarian contexts through interagency and intercluster coordination. We can think of several ways to move the needle. And I'm just going to read out some of them from this slide. So as we talked about before, on current state of fire safety in the humanitarian sector. We can collect existing evidence and insights from the sector, and I help to identify gaps. And of course, this is certainly not just from the presenters, but trying to bring together different insights and perspectives from people that have worked on fire safety around the world. We think there could be an opportunity for developing interagency coordination guidelines for fire safety. If you think about the cluster diagram I showed earlier with the different considerations of fire safety by each cluster that could be implemented, there's certainly quite a lot of thinking that needs to go into how do you coordinate for fire safety. There's certainly a need for fire safety training, such as mobile training guides for field staff. And we have this kind of idea around a fire safety toolkit that brings together methodologies and tools such as a fire risk assessment for camps or informal settlements that can be used by non-experts, as well as guidance, case studies, training materials, or advocacy materials. And ultimately, we really need to think about how can fire safety considerations be integrated into existing guidance or assessment tools used by the various clusters to really mainstream fire safety. And finally, there's definitely a need to continue the dialogue and think about what are the research and development needs. And to do this work, we really need to work collaboratively. Certainly this type of session, as Jim said, is a really great opportunity to have a discussion around what can be done to improve fire safety. And we're also trying to think of what mechanisms might we be able to use to enable peer-to-peer learning and engagement with a wide range of stakeholders, including fire safety specialists and humanitarians. I know we're a bit over the session, but it looks like we've been able to keep most of you on the call. So I'm going to hopefully steal a few more minutes of your time because we really do want to get your input and have a broader discussion. So in a minute, I'll kind of open it up for people to kind of chime in over video or audio. But in the meantime, we do have a couple of questions on menti.com that we'd really appreciate if you could kind of fill out. So to access these, you can either use your phone and use your camera to look at this QR code or QR code scanner, or you can just go to Menti digital code that you see on your screen. And you can kind of at your own pace go through two questions, and they're both open-ended. So one is, how do you already consider fire safety in your work? And the second is, what resources, tools, guidance, etc., or coordination mechanisms do you think are needed to improve fire safety in humanitarian settings? In a few minutes, I'll flash up some responses. But in the meantime, I just want to kind of open it up and see if anyone wants to. I think on this platform, you can either raise your hand or just really, it's a small group, so just unmute yourself and chime in with any comments or even things. I'm going to try to share my screen for the Menti responses as well.
Danielle, what was that code again? I think let's put it in the chat box.
I'll put it right in the chat box. Thank you. Okay, oops. Okay, there's the Menti code. If you just go to menti.com, then you can access that. And I'm just going to share my entire screen as well so that we can look at the code and any results that come in at the same time. So here's the code. So one just came up that was planning of camps, which I think is, you know, very relevant. And it reminded me that we're also having a session in the CCCM annual meeting on November 6th. So we are trying to engage with other clusters as well, since, as we talked about, inter-cluster coordination is really important. If you were interested in joining that conversation, we're going to be on Practitioners Day at 16:45 Geneva time on November 6th. So when we distribute out kind of the materials and the feedback forms for this session, we can also share a link to that session if you're interested. Although I will say there'll probably be a bit of repetition of what we talked about, but hopefully the discussion will be a bit different. Steve, are you still on the call?
Yep, I'm still here.
Would it be possible for you to share a little bit about about the Lebanon explosion and how the work that you talked about with the case study actually supported further support around the recent Beirut explosion? It's an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the continued support that we offer.
Yeah, I just think it's an interesting kind of parallel or to draw.
Well, I mean, yeah, as a kind of like a postscript, I suppose, to what Liz was talking about in terms of Lebanon, I think it's important to state that sort of like as Operation Florian, we've actually visited Lebanon 5 times and continued to provide kind of like support, both kind of like in country, but also out of country as well. I mean, not that Ryan and the team didn't need vast amounts of support, far from it, but we were very keen to continue to show our commitment in that regard. And I think in terms of the relationships that we've built up in country, both the Lebanese civil defence, but also with Ryan, what that did was that also facilitated a situation when the Beirut explosion happened, because of our wider networks within the fire and rescue service, we were able to assist with contacting colleagues who are involved in an NGO called SARAID, Search and Rescue and Assistance in Disasters, who are a mixed composition of search and rescue technicians, but also building engineers as well. So through the networks that we'd established, both civil society with the Rotary Club through Ryan, actually a lot of the success has to go to Ryan, we managed to deploy a team from the UK, and they led on the DAC, the Disaster Assistance Committee, to undertake building assessments for the whole of Beirut outside of the port area, leading with municipality of Beirut engineers, but also the Lebanese armed forces as well. So much so that our contacts in Lebanon through the Rotary Club have also managed to raise some funds to enable the SARAID team to return. They were hoping in December, but most probably it'll look January, February, depending on what the COVID situation looks like as well, to be able to continue that disaster management training in terms of building assessments and coding. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome.
And we're seeing a few responses come in around the first question of how do you consider fire safety in your work? Does anyone want to share a bit more about what they posted on Menti?
Well, it's Liz here. I can certainly talk from 2 aspects, 2 of the comments that I put up there. One is the planning of camps. So I used to work for UNHCR, where obviously we're setting up refugee camps, and the very, very basic sphere guidance of fire breaks was always applied to the planning of camps. But you know, we are fully aware that that is obviously not sufficient. You know, in the case of a big fire, but it does make a big difference when you see a fire in a refugee camp that spreads very quickly and then stops at that fire break, as opposed to the rapid spread of fire in the unplanned camps. So that's really, really important. And then I guess another one that I put up there, in fact, is not really shelter related, but it's guidance for managing warehouses. It's something that we've identified in Save the Children as a massive risk, in that, looking at incident reporting over the last 5 years, more than 50% of the fire incidents have all occurred in our warehouses and storerooms. And the very simple guidance around managing warehouses, keeping signage, evacuation clear, those sorts of things has already been put into place just to try and improve awareness, and it's now included in all the training. So that's obviously critical where we have a lot of flammable activities, and of course after the Beirut explosion, everyone's taking that a lot more seriously. So that was that's been two of the aspects that we worked on in Save the Children. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. If there aren't any other thoughts, I'll just move on to the next question, Amenti. So what resources, tools, guidance, etc., or coordination mechanisms do you think are needed to improve fire safety in humanitarian settings? You can use the same code actually to answer this question, and the same QR code as well. So it should just kind of guide you on Menti to the second question. Or if you have anything that you want to kind of share out loud, we'd love to hear it. Do people find these types of discussions useful? Does anyone have any kind of reflections on what we talked about today? Is there agreement on kind of this list even, or do people think this is an appropriate list of activities that we could do? Really just trying to get some feedback on how can we move forward to address these gaps.
It's a really good list, and does contribute to that sort of overarching goal of, you know, reducing fire-related deaths, injuries, and losses. In terms of sort of immediate steps, at least within this group now, you know, there might be scope for setting up a mailing list for once there are, you know, really salient, you know, milestones that we might want to cascade outwards. That would be my initial thought anyway.
Yeah, that's definitely something achievable. I think so. Well, great. I think with that, we'll close the session for today. But the Menti survey will continue to be open. So please, you know, even throughout the day, if you continue to think about this, please drop in your ideas, or of course reach out to us. So I'll just put up on the screen now our contact information. So myself, Jim, Liz, and Phil. And I really just want to say thank you so much for joining. This is a topic that, you know, we're really eager to try to address more strategically, and we really appreciate your involvement and support, and hopefully we can kind of work together in the future to address it. So thank you. Have a good rest of your day and stay safe.